Okay, you got to chime in. This isn't a thesis rebuttal thing. We're going head to head. I mean, we're dialogue. Well, Mark's ready, Tom. Let's go. Tom, I'm glad to have you with me on the program, and I want to talk about one of your favorite topics, the Soviet Union. And events happen there so fast, it seems impossible really to attend to them. But I'm interested in the situation with the ethnic revolts and with the questions of independence, secession. I think Lithuania perhaps is a prime example here, and the way Gorbachev is moving. I mean, as a layman, I might look at this whole thing and say Gorbachev must be getting pressure from the right wing and from the military to take a strong stand on the whole Lithuania situation. And they're probably, I mean, I have the sense that if he doesn't do that, you know, he could be in big trouble in his own country there.
Yes, let's set the background for this issue, Jim. Let's remember there are 15 separate republics in the Soviet Union. The word Soviet Union refers to the relationships between these 15 republics. Of those 15 republics, only one is made up of ethnic Russians.
Predominantly.
Predominant,
yeah.
Well, in the Federated Russian Republic, which includes probably something like 75% of the total land mass in the Soviet Union, about 95% of the people are ethnic Russians. That's the Federated Russian Republic, the largest of the republics. The capital of that republic, as well as of the Soviet Union, is Moscow. So we get that picture. The other 15 republics include people from at least 100 different nationalities and ethnic backgrounds. Now, these people speak different languages, they have different history, different culture. Of those 14 republics, which are not made up of ethnic Russians, the three which probably have the most strained relations with Moscow, in an historical sense at least, are the three Baltic republics. Now picture the Soviet Union to the east, picture Eastern Europe and Western Europe to the west. Sandwiched in between is the Baltic area. All right, now there are three republics there. That is Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Those are the three Baltic republics. Now those people have a very different political and historical background than the Russians. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's good to remember when they were annexed. This happened in 1940.
That's correct.
So
forcible annexation.
That's right, and very difficult times produced for the Lithuanians, for example. I mean, they were under terrible pressure from the Soviets. Some of their leading intellectuals were shipped off to Siberia. The dissenters were in trouble. The priests, who were very important to the Lithuanians, the Lithuanian people revered their priests. They were very helpful to them, especially in the villages. And the priests, therefore, were often shipped off to Siberia, never to be seen again. Mm-hmm. And so when the Nazis came at the beginning of the Second World War and invaded, actually the Lithuanians saw that as a liberation. They thought that they were going to be better off. And of course, they had their own means of repression and so on, and it was very difficult for them as well. So, I mean, I think it's good to get that historical sense in there and what happened around 1940 when they were actually annexed to the Soviet Union, because then the Soviets came back and the Nazis withdrew, and many of the leading Lithuanians tried to get out right at the end, to go to the west with the Nazis.
Yes.
In fact, I was talking to one gentleman who was saying that they got on the last railroad train out of Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, and the bodies of the Nazi soldiers were piled on the train. And they threw off the dead Nazi soldiers and put themselves in there to get out, and sort of piled whatever belongings they had. That last train before the Soviets came back. So as bad as the Nazis were, they saw the Soviet repression as even worse.
Yes, and I think that sets the stage for our discussion, which is, if I understand it, is who's right over there? Are the Lithuanians right when they say, look, we have the legal and moral right, based on this history that we have been discussing, to secede from the Soviet Union? And I think even the language we use in discussing this needs to take that history into account. For example, many Lithuanians would say, I didn't state that correctly a moment ago. They would say, we are not seceding from the Soviet Union. We are merely reasserting our right to exist as a nation which pre-existed the Stalin-Hitler pact in 1940, when the two of them made a secret pact to, in effect, to divide up Poland and the regions around Poland as part of a cynical bargain for dividing up the world. And we know what happened. Hitler went back on the bargain, and the Nazis marched across of course, across Poland into the Soviet Union, and in the process, Lithuania got caught up in this history which you just described. So as we discuss this, we have to understand.
Right, and what you see is the great
context.
antipathy, therefore, that existed. Now, earlier on, the Lithuanians used to, at times, go off to Moscow to study. It was interesting because they didn't have their own universities there, so the leading intellectuals had to go off to different places. And so you got some sort of ties there that ought to be factored in as well. Mm-hmm. The training within the universities in Moscow that probably influenced them. But you take the intellectuals, the clergy, the dominant figures had every reason to dislike the Russians, and the history was a very difficult one.
Sure. Now that we've set the stage here and given some background to this discussion, I would suggest you probably up to this point, listeners would say they seem to be slanting this very much in the direction of the rights and the interests of the Lithuanians. Now let's try and pretend that you and I are a couple of Russians, and we're sitting here speaking to a program, and our audience is made up of predominantly of Russian speaking people who are residents of Moscow or Leningrad or some of the areas in the Federated Russian Republic. How might we look at this history? How might we discuss this in terms of our historical perspective? Why don't you begin on that?
Well, I would say, first of all, you have a rethinking of history within the Soviet Union. I mean, there's all kind of examples of where people are now looking at the Stalinist era and willing to see some of the difficulties involved in that. I would think that that's one thing in the mix within the Politburo today. It is that we have to be honest about our history, and that the Stalinist era was a tremendously brutal one. I mean, just wiping out people right and left. I mean, just these terrible purges that have to be factored in. So, I mean, that becomes at least one part in the overall history. That is a self-criticism that I believe they have to bring to it. I mean, my own opinion is, layman and, not an expert or anything, is that Gorbachev, given his own instincts, would be very attuned to that. I mean, he's the one who's opened up this whole movement of glasnost, as he calls it. I mean, this openness and this rewriting of history, which from a more objective viewpoint that they're having. I think everything about Gorbachev's background, current mindset says we ought to have an openness to what's going on in Lithuania, admit the mistakes of the past. I see it on the model of Afghanistan. His model was, well, the previous regime got us into Afghanistan. That was a big mistake. It was one of the worst things we ever did. Now we're going to get out. I think he has the room to do that, but he's not doing it. My answer is it's because the right wing is there, the military complex, etc., is saying, no, if Lithuania goes, then Georgia might go, and heaven forbid the Ukraine would go, which produces 30% of the grain and has, what they have a 51 million population, I think, the Ukrainians. Mm-hmm. So they couldn't afford to ever lose the Ukraine. So if you had that would go, then the whole thing falls apart. Mm-hmm. That's what okay, that's my guess as to what's going on.
Yeah, I think what you have just said, to summarize what you've just said, is that Gorbachev is not Stalin. Gorbachev is not Brezhnev, who Brezhnev tried to keep the Stalin era in existence as long as he could. Gorbachev has been the catalyst for the most momentous changes in the history of that region of the country, and that Gorbachev has in fact done what he said he intended to do when he announced perestroika, glasnost, and democratization in the Soviet Union. And as a result of his leadership, and I would suggest that his leadership has been possible because there are hundreds of thousands, particularly younger people in the Soviet Union, that were not prepared to tolerate that system much longer and who were ready for a Gorbachev to come along. Nevertheless, Gorbachev has come along and has rode the crest of these sentiments for change to the point where they now have something approaching a genuine parliamentary system of government. That is a legislature elected by the people. I mean, Gorbachev has an executive president, not exactly the same as our system, but with many similarities. And interestingly enough, they have tried to pattern in many respects their new system on our system here in the United States. Now, why do I say that? I say that because the problem is a very, very difficult one. Gorbachev, I think you're correct. Gorbachev probably doesn't have any choice but to repudiate the attempt by Lithuania to declare its independence. And so we are now raising some very difficult moral questions. Let's suppose we were here talking as people interested in the success of perestroika and glasnost. I might say as one Russian to another, I wish the Lithuanians would try to appreciate what Mr. Gorbachev faces. If we lose Gorbachev, we could well find ourselves back where there is a crackdown in our human rights, and our future will be set back by tens of years and even longer.
Well, I do think that's a crucial point. And I think if you would take the Lithuanians here in the United States, I mean, they want more bold action from our government. They'd like to see President Bush stand up. And Lithuania has consistently said that the problem is that the West is not recognizing their independence, and that if we did do that, we would strengthen their hand. But we're not doing that, and I think the answer comes back to that is that we don't want to lose Gorbachev. We don't want to see him out of power because he's the one who has opened up all of these possibilities. And so, I mean, I think you're right in saying we have a moral dilemma here, a social ethical question of momentous proportions. I think that, to argue the one side of it would say, and I think what Gorbachev is insisting on, take your time and you'll get it. If you'll work within my time frame, and I think he's thrown out ideas like 5 years or something, that then we will be able to work something out. So withdraw your statement of independence, and then let's enter into dialogue, open dialogue, and probably we will find a structure that we can use along this line. I think that's a whole issue of social ethics here. I mean, as we would examine, I mean, I know it's world politics and it's geopolitical, and I mean, the stakes are the highest, but I mean, from my viewpoint as a theologian, it's social ethics where I would locate all of this. And what we find in social ethics very often is a lot of gray areas. You find power struggles going on. You look for what Reinhold Niebuhr, the great American Protestant theologian, called proximate justice. You can't get ideals. You can't get total justice. Now, if I guessed what Reinhold Niebuhr might say here, this is dangerous. I better not put it in that context. Let me back off of that and just say, using some of Niebuhr's principles, you could argue on the one side, and I've actually heard ethnic Lithuanians say this, that the Lithuanians should go slow, that they can get what they want in the long run. It's the same feeling many people have about the Chinese students. If they had backed the right leader there and not hurt him publicly, and if they'd given him a chance and rode along with him, they might have been able to further the revolution. But by taking this tremendously hard stand, they forced the more reactionaries to the fore, and their friends in government fell. Now, I think there's ethnic Lithuanians who see it that way, who say, maybe we have to back off, and we're looking at a period of time when we could make progress. So that's what I would call proximate justice here, and I think that
well, I think those are interesting working concepts. But if we bring it back to the more practical level,
Tom, theology is practical.
Well,
that's what you have to remember. Theology is practical.
Well, I'm sure it is for you theologians who write books and collect royalties and drive Mercedes-Benz. That was totally untrue. It is a cheap shot.
That is what we call an ad hominem argument.
It is an ad hominem argument, but I was urged and provoked into doing that by a member of the Word in Edgewise Society who knew I was coming on your program and would have to struggle to find something to say.
Go ahead.
But
if you keep it at a legal level here, I'll be okay. Just go ahead.
One of the interesting aspects of the problem as you presented it is what might Lithuania expect if Gorbachev and his reforms survive? Well, one possibility, as is being actively discussed now, is a federative relationship between Moscow and the republics, those 15 republics that we talked about. under that federative relationship, it must be presumed, if they're to model their system on ours, the individual republics would have the same, something approaching the kind of autonomy that the 50 states of the United States enjoy in their relationship with the federal government. And
I think the proposals are a little looser federation than that, aren't they?
Well, perhaps, but you see, at least at the early stages, we may be talking about a loose federation, or something like, for example, the relationship which exists between the British dominions, where there is a loose relationship.
Now there I think you have a more reasonable kind of model, probably.
Right, that may be more, or something, for example, like the relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico, that kind of thing. But however they work it out, I think an argument can be made that in the long term it is far from clear that the people of Lithuania will be better off if they choose the course of total independence from Moscow.
At this point.
At this point. I mean, it's far from clear that that would be the outcome. And therefore, coming back, I think an argument can be made that, coming back to your concept of proximate justice, I think that that an argument might be made here that if we were to frame it in terms of proximate justice, there is an argument on the Russian side of this, that
what I agree with that.
The Lithuanians are doing is short-sighted, and therefore, as a matter of social ethics, is wrong.
Yeah, and I think we could extend that to looking at our own foreign policy on this question. In other words, I personally would be supportive of all the efforts to keep Gorbachev in power, and that we must deal with the Soviet Union as the main power broker in the world, and that we can't obviously sell out Lithuania. I mean, we can't have another Munich on our hands, but we can do that, keep their own interest in mind. In other words, I think there's a moral stance that says we could support Gorbachev on this thing, where he's saying go slow, withdraw the whole Declaration of Independence that they had, on the grounds that in the long run it will be better for Lithuania, that it will be morally the better choice, because they will be able to avoid tanks on their streets and Soviets imposing on them, and in the long run will get the kind of independence they need.
Yes.
And then you got to think also in terms of the longer range political structure of the Soviet Union, which I think is destined to break up in one way or another, and also the economic bonds that one might try to keep in the region.
Yeah, I think your observation brings us around to the position of the administration, and I think an argument can be made that President Bush's position on the Lithuanian problem is consistent with our most cherished beliefs, and is consistent with our commitment to human rights. It's consistent in the sense that unless and until it can be shown that as a matter of social ethics and as a matter of law, of international law and morality, you have a clear-cut case for the United States applying its commitment to independence and democracy and human rights, in this case on the side of the Lithuanians, or on the side of the Russians for that matter, until the evidence becomes clear enough. I think President Bush is probably following a wise course.
I would agree. Let me bring up what I would call the whole question of religious liberty here, which I think is very important, because the Lithuanians are largely a Christian people, and having been evangelized early on, and carries that tradition in their bones and in their hearts, and the clergy and the church are very important to them. Now, they're moving into a position where they can have greater religious freedom. I mean, Gorbachev, in his talk with the Pope, has spoken of religious liberty in the Soviet Union, and assured the Pope that they want to move in that direction. And as a matter of fact, there have been concrete examples of this. So I think the cathedral in Vilnius, if I'm not mistaken, was turned into a museum, and as was typical, procedure by the Soviets, following their Marxist principle that religion was the opiate of the people, they needed to squelch religion, and they did it in very obvious ways. Thank goodness they didn't tear down many of those cathedrals, but they turned them into museums. But now, as I understand it, in Vilnius, is changing back to a church now, where people can come and worship. So the religious liberty element is extremely important to the Lithuanians. They've kept the faith alive throughout all these years in sort of an underground kind of way, and now it's been able to come more to the surface. I would think that Gorbachev could easily go along with that and say, well, while we're in this 5-year negotiating period, if that's what he wants, there's no reason why we can't maximize the religious freedom and give more of that to the people. And so the Lithuanians can sort of gradually take hold in that way, get religion back to the public place it should be, work on the indigenous clergy and the previous relationships.
Yeah, I quite agree with that. I think it should be pointed out also that not only have the Soviets permitted the reopening of churches in Lithuania, they have in fact, Gorbachev has in fact repudiated the concept of religious, direct and indirect religious oppression. And in fact, now, as recently as just about 4 or 5 weeks ago, Russian Orthodox religious services are being shown on television in the Soviet Union. Now, this is incredible. This is maybe the most astonishing repudiation of Marxist-Leninist teaching, or the most astonishing example of repudiation of Marxist-Leninist teaching in this whole period of momentous change. Because I can recall being in the Soviet Union and seeing, when I would go to church there, seeing fear on the faces of people when I would try to approach them at the church. They would immediately perceive that I was a foreigner. They would feel fear. Well, Gorbachev has said that was wrong. He has come out and said this was wrong, and we're not going to do that. And people are free to worship, and they are free to now not only worship, but priests are free to preach publicly, which was forbidden. There was there was in their constitution the right to go to. They proclaimed anyway that you had the right under Brezhnev and Stalin to go to church. The fact is that if you were known to be a practicing Christian or believer of any faith, you were persecuted in many and sundry and often indirect and mean-spirited ways.
That included perhaps not getting promoted on the job, maybe losing the job, not being able to travel. Yes. I think that was one of the great ones. And so they had a whole network, didn't they, of knowing who went to church and kept records of that. And so the churchgoers, there's no wonder when you approached them that they would be fearful. I mean, because you had a whole history along that line. So I think it often surprises people that their churches are open and you could go there in the major cities in the Soviet Union, but you were subtly persecuted, or maybe not so subtly.
In some cases subtly, in other cases not so subtly. But I think your point's well taken, that the Lithuanians are now in a position where they can say to Moscow and to Gorbachev, if you're going to try to prevent us from seceding, we want, and if negotiations, as I think many people hope happen, come about, and progress is made toward some resolution of this standoff that now exists, I think one of the things the Lithuanians can say to Moscow is, look, we want a lot of help from you in restoring our churches. We want it absolutely clear that our Catholic tradition will be respected in every way, that we shall have the right here in our republic to pass laws, making it clear that people have the right not only to practice their religion openly, but to preach, to write, and so forth. So that there are tremendous bargaining chips available to the Lithuanians in this complex situation in the area of religious freedom.
Yeah, and I think Gorbachev is probably looking for opportunities like that, if the analysis is correct that it is the right wing and the military and so on that is putting the pressure on him, that he needs this room, and that I think that could be a good place for him to maneuver. Tom, another element of this I think that's important is what it's doing to the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States, and the coming summit and so on. What the administration has consistently said that this matters to us. What happens in Lithuania is important to us in terms of the ongoing treaties that we're trying to work out and so on. I get an impression through the press these days that progress is slowing down. In other words, you'll have stories in the paper saying, well, we're not making as much progress on START as we thought we were going to. It looks like there's more opposition and more questions and so on. I have the feeling that Lithuania is really trouble in terms of these larger issues. And I think that Shevardnadze made that clear to our senators. You got a lot of indications of that look, don't buck us on this one because we're in a precarious position over there. Give us a break. We need time. On the other hand, our people are saying, look, if you use force in Lithuania, then this is going to hurt the arms agreement. And we all know that Gorbachev needs the arms agreement. That is absolutely crucial to him. I think of him sometimes getting up in the morning, Tom, and saying, I have one more major world problem. I mean, day after day. It's incredible.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you, and it would be tragic if the Lithuanian problem were to result in the ouster of Gorbachev and the return to power of the reactionaries who then cracked down, for example, those who we know are there and who would like to see a return to the good old days from their point of view, when the Communist Party controlled things from the center, where everything was dictated from the center by the Communist Party, when all the power and the privileges of high position were in the hands of leaders in the Communist Party. There is as you can well imagine, the changes which are occurring in the Soviet Union are extremely unsettling to the people. I was just there a short time ago, and people are frightened. They don't know, they don't understand these changes, and they have not been prepared for them by their history, and their culture hasn't prepared them for it. And so now we have these enormous changes, these enormous opportunities. And while educated people who study these things and who can really benefit from a more free system are all for it, the ordinary working man and woman is frightened to death by all this. And those are the ingredients of a potential tragedy in which Gorbachev could go and all these opportunities for change could pass us by.
Right, and that's something that our government, as they assess the overall situation, has to make sure does not happen. So, Tom, we've been talking about Soviet Union and its relationship to the republics, and talking about Lithuania. We've roamed over the area of religious freedom and how important that is, and the geopolitical question of how it affects the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. It is no doubt, they're fascinating times we live in, and so interesting. And, of course, from the theologian's perspective, I want to see it in terms of social ethics and trying to bring the moral dimension into these large international questions.